Welcome back, everyone, to part 21 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are moving on past religion and into writing, so writing in Mesopotamia. There are only a couple of chapters left, if I remember correctly, and so we're coming to the end of this series. Stay with us. After this series, we are going to get into sex and eroticism in ancient Mesopotamia, so should be a really great series. But today, we are going to look at an introduction to the writing. So we're going to look at the major writing systems, what I like to call the way of clay, and the many uses for writing. So the three major writing systems in the area that we're calling the ancient Near East would be, of course, the very well-known Egyptian hieroglyphic script, the somewhat later Mediterranean alphabetic scripts, and then, of course, the one that is most pertinent to our studies, and that is Mesopotamian cuneiform, or wedge-shaped writing. And we'll mention this again. You can look there at the bottom of your screen. That is wedge-shaped writing. That's cuneiform. So they would take a stylus and impress it into often wet clay. Sometimes they would, incise things into stone or something, but clay, what? So clay is the medium that is extraordinarily common in ancient Mesopotamia. Many hundreds of thousands of tablets are formed out of clay. And again, it's a relatively easy to find, cheap, very, very durable medium to use. And of course, for us, it's fantastic. We're so glad that they used it. Because when it dries, or when it's even better, when it's fired, clay is, very easy to preserve, and relatively speaking, relative to something like papyrus or parchment. So tablets are formed out of clay, usually, roughly hand-shaped. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but sometimes they can be covered with what's called a slip, and it's just a moist thin layer of mud that goes on the outside that allows for greater precision with the wedges so that you can write more finely. They were impressed with a stylus, either of reed or of wood. Of course, the gods use a lapis lazuli reed stylus. A lapis lazuli reed stylus, a lapis lazuli stylus. So shapes were formed to form logograms, later syllables and determinatives. And we'll get into that in a little more detail, I think, in the next episode. If you want to know more about the basics of the writing system, Megan has a phenomenal daily data. Oh, the name I think is Introduction. Nope. It's something about writing. I can't remember the name of it. And as I said, it's extraordinarily durable compared to papyrus, parchment, leather, wood, etc. So there are many uses for writing. Oppenheim lists a number of them. I'll go through them. There are administrative texts, legal documents, texts that record mythology, annals, and scholarly traditions. So let's take them one by one. Administrative texts. The early organizations, the palace and the temple, required record keeping. When you had people bringing 2 sheep and 1 goat into the temple as a tax or as tribute or whatever, you needed to have a scribe there. You needed to somehow record the transaction, both incoming and the receipt, so that the temple needed to know, for example, how many sheep and how many goats they had taken in. And instead of walking out to the pasture every time you wanted to know that, they wrote it down. They used writing for record keeping, also to generate receipts for people that brought those goods to the temple and for other transactions. So it was necessary to document this incoming tax, tribute, yields, to track outgoing distributions and rations. And so administrative writing, administrative texts were a very important part of the bureaucratic system and writing was used from a very, very early stage to track bureaucratic transactions. Legal documents. So we have evidence. We have extant Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hittite legal texts. They're often referred to as codes. Of course, they're not codes, but we've talked about that in other places. But we do have legal documents, so writing was used for that. Oppenheim cites two of the purposes for putting these laws into writing. One was replacing and formalizing these oral traditions and procedures that were used in their legal system. And two, aligning and defining legal practices with respect to current social norms. So these legal texts functioned in such a way to freeze or to formalize these oral traditions and procedures, but also to bring them into alignment with what was contemporary at the time. Mythological texts, what he refers to as sacred lore. So I thought a quote here was actually really useful. Quote, a record of the story of a deity, this is what he's calling the sacred lore, of a religious figure or of an ethnic or otherwise coherent unit, inasmuch as such a story is incorporated into the ideology that sustains the circle of worshipers and the congregation of believers. In other words, what are their religious texts? Records of this type are written down for the purpose of maintaining a corpus of traditions, beliefs, and precepts under changing social conditions or under outside pressure. In other words, it is designed to freeze their traditions, to make it, and this is one of the things that religious texts do. You see this, for example, in Latin in the Roman Catholic Church. Not that I have an expertise in that or anything, but those traditions were frozen and had great sustainability diachronically. So that's what he's referring to as the sacred lore, these mythological texts. Annals. So early bureaucratic documents, the ones that we were talking about earlier, were often dated, right? They needed to be. Legal texts were dated. And so these dating systems were often based on year names or name of a high official or the king. And these lists were formed based on the sequence of year names or of eponym lists, of eponyms. And so you have year name lists, eponym lists, and these annals, the annals which are used, these are texts that can be cautiously used by modern researchers to reconstruct history, particularly sequential reigns of kings, and of course, because of some of the information that's contained in the annals, outside of simple year names, we can get at least to some degree further specificity in historical writing. Scholarly texts. We talked a couple of... we spoke recently about the art of the diviner and his role in ancient Mesopotamia. Those practices were documented. So the practices and the tools of the diviner, diviner's reports, these things are written in these what we call scholarly texts, the movements of the planets. These are texts that are part of the scholarly tradition, particularly in the first millennium, which uses to a much greater degree logographic forms to ensure that only the initiated can read and interact with these scholarly texts. Some other uses for writing, we have letters from many different periods, text for public consumption, for example, Middle Babylonian kudurus. These are what we call boundary stones. There's, of course, a lot of writing and debate about those, but designed, at least to some degree, for public consumption. Royal inscriptions, of course, these were not for public consumption. At least generally speaking, these were for the gods. Okay, in summation, while there were other major systems of writing in the ancient Near East, The plethora of remains in Mesopotamia are the result of the high level of preservation of the cuneiform clay tablets. Cuneiform, this wedge-shaped writing, found many, many uses, including, as I say here, everything from letter writing and administrative documentation to the mythical and scholarly traditions of the scribes and the scholars, particularly in the first millennium. Coming up on Wednesday, we're going to take a look at the Mesopotamian scribe and his craft. So a bit more detail about what the scribe did in particular. We've looked at the uses of writing. Now we're going to look in more detail at the scribe and his profession. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?